Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Sorry we're a couple of minutes late, but welcome to the July edition of the Sona webinar series. We're going to be talking all about rostering today. Really excited to have a really great panel with us as well. So just while people are joining and while we try and get our third speaker, Becky, onto the stage, just a couple of quick housekeeping bits, really. The main thing is that all opinions that are expressed today are the speaker's own. We are going to be using the chat function and the poll function. So please do interact with us and chat to us. Let us know what you think. And yeah, we'd love to hear what you have to say on rostering. And we'll spend about 40 minutes today, well, probably about 35 minutes today, chatting through some key points on rostering. We'll then have a bit of a Q&A, and then we'll have Hemel from Sona joining to do a bit of a demo on our own rostering system at Sona. So without further ado, let's start by introducing the 2 out of 3 panelists that we have here already. So Rich, would you like to kick us off by introducing? Oh, Rich, you're on mute.
It continues, hey, the fun continues. Hi everyone, I'm Richard, I'm the head of product here at Sona. So I look after everything that we build ultimately and make sure that our system meets our customers' needs. And here is Becky, fantastic. Yeah, before I joined Sona, I spent the last 10 years working in the health and social care sector. I spent 3 years responsible for helping managers across the organisation schedule their staff and build a roster, which seems quite pertinent to today's topic. And I spent 2 years sort of procuring and implementing tech solutions. So hopefully I can bring some of that today. I'll hand over to Hayley.
Thanks, Rich. Afternoon, everybody. I'm Hayley Horwood. I'm employed by Sona as a care consultant. I've been with the guys for around about 5 weeks now, so they come to me for advice and guidance on the care sector. Privy to do this role, actually, I was working for a large tech organisation that specialised in technology and transformation in the social care sector. And prior to that, I worked in the social care sector for some large domiciliary care providers for about 15 years. So I've been in the social care space for about coming up to 20 years, which makes me sound old. And I'll hand you over to Becky.
Becky, sorry about the slight delay there. I'm in, yes. So I've been working in health and social care about 20 years, and I'm with you on the making me feel slightly older than I was ready for today. I've been rostering for almost all of those years as well, so this is something that is close to my heart and has taken a lot of my time, but I do love it. So excited for the conversation.
Great stuff. Thanks, guys. So without further ado, let's get cracking. So the first question that I'm going to open up to the room is just the big one, really. What is it that makes a good roster? Rich, shall we start with you?
That is a big question, right? And into 40 minutes of chat. So for me, the one thing I had to tell managers more and more, which for a tech guy was rare, is a roster is like 2 different people's lives, right? Like it's whoever you're providing care for, be that people in a home, in a setting, or one-to-one, or whatever your setting is, and it's a staff member. So what makes a good roster is one that people can see. It's not one that comes out the week before you need to work it. It's whatever state it is, whatever you think you know, is sharing it, like that visibility to the worker, and often, if necessary, to the person that you're supporting. So yeah, my really boring but really succinct answer is I think a good roster is one that people can see. I think the other panelists and for the rest of the talk will talk a lot more about how do you make a good roster and good time slots and things. But the headline is, yeah, it's like it's people's lives at the end of the day. So a good one is ones that people are aware of and people can adhere to and that stays slightly consistent. But before I ramble on, I'll hand over for Becky sort of first thoughts.
No, I completely agree. I think it's all about, for me, the heart of a good rotor is all about the people that we're supporting, right? So if we've got the right people at the right time, then they are going to have a good day and a good week and be doing the things that they want to do. It is equally important that the people we employ have as much notice of their rota as possible. That really helps with their work-life balance. That helps them plan all of the things that they've got to fit into their home lives as well as their work lives. And I think if we're getting that out for as far in advance as possible, around that kind of 2 to 3 month mark, that seems to really, really work for the people that we employ. It means they know when they're on their weekends and when they're on their nights and all of those things that come with working in health and social care. And then it means that we have the right people turning up at the right time, which is what's so important for the people that we support.
Yeah, I'll talk as well if that's okay. So I think, like you said, Rich, ease of use, visibility, but it also brings it back to communication, right? So I'll give you an example. About 15 years ago, when I was sat in a branch and they didn't have a rostering solution at the time, and they weren't using Excel, they'd literally bring a packet of Post-it notes in every week, and then they'd write it down on the Post-it notes and put it on the wall. We weren't allowed to open the windows because if the wind blew the Post-it notes, then the roster was just a disaster. It makes me chuckle to think that that's what we used to do on a weekly basis. Anyway, we advanced from the Post-it notes to paper, and we'd write down the rosters, and we'd get the care workers to come in on a Friday for the following week. So on that Friday, I pretty much spent my whole day rewriting rosters, and I sat there and I thought, this isn't working, what we're going to do. Clearly, we went onto a system, but what we did alongside onboarding that system was look at the process. Instead of rostering for the following week, we would roster for say 2 or 3 weeks, bring the staff in, but show them the roster and go, right, this is what we're about to print. This is roster for 2 to 3 weeks. What's your thoughts? Is there any tweaks or changes before we actually published it? And I think that really went down well with the staff as well. They felt really engaged by it. We were asking for their buy-in. So yeah, we've come on a long way.
That's a great point, Hayley. I think a good roster is also live, like as much as it's shared. So again, I've been in care homes before where the roster's printed and put on the wall, and then a staff member's photocopied it for themselves, but left that on the side. And then in the same room, you now have 2 copies of the same roster that different people were going in and amending, and then being slightly surprised when no one turned up to the shift. And so having a single source of truth, ideally from that perspective, so you can't copy it, etc., digital and online that people can access. I'm really interested, Becky, if you're sharing your rosters 2 to 3 months in advance is fantastic. And I think makes having it live all the more important. Are rosters complete at that point? How are you handling schedules, getting them out so far in advance?
For most of the people that we support, we have a kind of a rough sense of what an average week looks like, and we will rota to that. The people that we employ can then kind of make requests around a preferred day off, so not an annual leave day, but just actually, do you know what, it would really help me out if I can have that day off this week. And using Sona, then we will put all of that together. Whether our rota was out 2 hours in advance, 2 days in advance, or 2 months in advance, it's always going to be live. There are always going to be, because of the nature of what we do, those things that come our way at 5 o'clock on a Friday, and there's always those fabulous times. So it will always be live. And I think prior to us going live with Sona in March, we had that exact example you gave of people coming in and photocopying rotas, and we could have had 20 versions of somebody that printed off the last rota that they happened to get sent, and that always just created so much confusion. And we were spending a lot of time not actually resolving rotating issues, but just trying to resolve the confusion. So what Sona has done is meant that when there are those last minute changes, we can just send a message out and let people know this has changed because of this. And so everyone is always working from that single point of the truth. And that means that we can be out in advance, but people still know that we will shimmy things around as we need to, because that's the nature of what we do.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Great. Should we move on to the next topic? So we would like to know how effective rostering can improve the overall quality of care. Anyone want to kick us off with this one?
I mean, I'm always happy to talk, but Becky's probably more interesting than me on this one. Go on, Becky.
I was going to jump in there. I think for me, effective rotering is all, and the quality piece is all about consistency. It's all about making sure you've got that core team there at any given point in time, so the people we support know the faces that are going to be supporting them. Those relationships are there. They know what they're going to get with that, and that just makes for a better day for everybody, but especially for them. So whenever we rota, that's what we'll rota for first. We'll rota in our core team across the whole spread of what we need to do, and then we'll work to fill in the gaps around that. But it is that consistency piece, whether it's our staff or whether it's with agency staff that we might be using, because that's what we need to do sometimes. It is making sure that those regular names are in those spots. So, and then it's matching skill sets, right? So if someone we support is going swimming on a Tuesday and that's what they love to do and that's really important, there's absolutely no point westering a non-swimmer. That's going to be really unhelpful for the whole situation. So we'll start to skill match that way. The same with drivers, and the same, it might be some family relationships where somebody we support is a key worker, someone we employ even, is a key worker, and it's really important that they're the one that's going to go and see mum because they've got some other conversations that they're going to have. So that's how we'll build it in the first instance, and I think that's what makes the biggest difference to the quality of what we do.
Fantastic. And I think the other side of what you're saying, as I completely agree, I think continuity is incredibly important, and then it sounds completely counteractive, but flexibility is the other thing that I think is super important. And you people, how can you have both, right? If something's continuous, how is it flexible? And I think you hit the nail on the head, Becky. It's like you've got those core shifts. And it doesn't matter whether it's people you support and their main 1-to-1 hours maybe that matter the most, or whether it's a care home and it's the mornings when getting people out of bed and understanding the people that you're with matter most. Whatever care setting you're in, you have these core shifts, and that's where you really need your continuity and want to strive. And then you have your other shifts. The second person providing 2-to-1 care maybe, or people in the afternoons in traditional care homes are often what's the right word? It's not perhaps as intense as in the mornings and those routines. And they're the shifts where maybe you don't need to assign people, you don't need to fill people, and you can allow that flexibility so that people can pick up the shifts that make sense for them in that week or for that day, even depending on what they've got with childcare and other things. So I think for me, it's the two sides. Continuity, I want to know which weekends I'm working, and the people we're supporting want to be cared for by people they recognise and they know. But then flexibility again for the staff to be able to have a work-life balance that makes sense for them.
Yeah, totally. Just second that, Rich. I think continuity is key, right? Especially in the home care or dom care sector, if you've got a lot, well, not even just those sectors, you've got customers with dementia and you're sending in somebody new every single day, that's going to really confuse them, right? And I think from my experience of working in the sector, that was really, really key, that you were sending in the right people in terms of their skill set, but also the same person as many times as they possibly could in that week, in that day, delivering that care for Mr. or Mrs. Jones who has dementia. And I know when we implemented the rostering solutions, that really helped us to kind of define all of that.
And then again, it builds on the team as well, right? To the overall quality of care is more than just that person that's coming in. It's maybe the person that's following and how those handovers go, or it's maybe how that team work together at the same time. And if you've got a happy, engaged workforce because they're working, they're not being dragged in on times when they can't work. And they're, to Becky's point, if you've got staff suggesting availability, if you're able to match that wherever possible, anything to keep the staff happy and engaged leads to happier, better cared for residents on the whole, right? And everything can start with the schedule.
Yeah, exactly, Rich. And look, you know, you've got your workforce, they're all very special in terms of, you know, specialist skill set and what they do. But, you know, again, from experience, when care workers had their rotas, they like going in to see their regular customers. They liked also producing that continuity of work. And we found that we, sorry, someone said that my volume's too low, so hopefully you can hear me. Lost my train of thought. We found that if we had continuity for both customer and workforce, then it was win-win because the staff would be super happy with their rota, go and see their regulars, and vice versa. Can you guys hear me okay? Someone's just messaged saying yeah? Okay, sorry if others can't.
That's right. Cool. So let's move on slightly and talk about some of the challenges that you faced when creating a rostered workforce. So what kind of key things come up in your experiences? Rich?
Go on then. I say there's always the standoff at the beginning. So retention for me was when I used to go and speak to managers. We would be in worlds where they'd be like, staff are leaving. And I'm like, cool. I was like, I'm here to talk about the roster. I can't roster, I don't have any staff. And you talk to the staff and you're like, oh, why did Jess leave? He said, oh, she's gone to working in the care home across the street. That's weird. Why has Jess gone to work at the care home across the street? Oh, she can't do Tuesdays. And the manager never listened and always put her on a Tuesday. And it's like, okay, and this just comes back to it being people's lives, and it really can be as simple as that. Like one of the places I worked in the past didn't allow for availability in the same way that Becky said. And the roster, once it came out, maybe with 1 week's notice, maybe with 2 if you were lucky, was the roster that you were expected to work. And if you couldn't, then that you know, then you were sick or you were absent, and it went down a HR route, and that's a problem. It's, to me, a challenge of scheduling is that you need to be able to respect people's availability, and you can't expect people to be available 7 days a week, all day, every day. I'm certainly not. I couldn't be called in at various times, right? We have children, we have school plays, we have doctor's appointments, we have these things. So the challenge is getting the schedule right. I believe, in my personal experience, keeps staff. Therefore, if you get it wrong, you have less staff, which then makes it harder to schedule, and you end up in this horrible wheel. So I think that was the biggest challenge I faced.
It's probably when we don't have enough staff, and I think with COVID and Brexit and other things that are bigger really than my brain can comprehend, it just has been a bit of a disaster for health and social care, and the whole sector. It just has made for a recruitment nightmare, and if you haven't got the staff, then rostering becomes really, really tricky, doesn't it? Because there's just all these gaps. So what we have been doing is working really closely with some agency colleagues. And I have to say, most of them are fabulous, you know, but what Sona enables us to do is it means that we can map our core staff first, and we can then, on top of that, layer consistent agency colleagues, so that while they might not be directly employed by us, they become a part of our teams. They work for us day in, day out, sometimes just as regularly as our own staff. And then that consistency, while it's not necessarily directly through us, it does build for the people that we support. And that comes back to the point I was making earlier about consistency for people, because it is just so important.
No, sorry, go on.
Because I'm very polite there, Rich. But just the other thing that I wanted to say about that was what the other thing that we've been able to do by using this app is enable people to see what's available in houses that they might not necessarily have been aware of. So lockdown did this really awful thing for people where it just put everybody in those bubbles, didn't it? And then our teams weren't allowed to go and work in other houses. And people that joined the sector at that point didn't know that was something that we could do. So actually, as the lockdowns got lifted and things changed, people were just really out of practice of that way of working. They weren't used to just, you know, getting to know other people and going to work in other places. So now we've been able to like pop up a map of where houses are, and I think people have been really surprised by the locations of some of the things that we do. And that will just, and then they can see the shifts that are available. So it just gives them more choice, which gives them more flexibility, which plays into previous points too. And then it just created a different sort of, it's lifted, I think, that sense of, well, we can't go and work anymore. And it's given people the ability to see the opportunities that are available to them. And that's been really, really brilliant for us. It's been a real game changer.
That makes lots of sense. I've got a couple of questions to dig into there, because I think, again, with challenges and the roster, agency is really interesting. I come from a world where agency was always very separate from the scheduling system, which comes with its own challenges. At the point, I've got X people that are turning up here from my organization, and I've got a list of people that are turning up in a disparate place. You're able to see them all together, right, Becky? And how does that change things for you? Does that simplify?
Say that last bit again for me, Rich. I had a slight glitch there. Sorry.
I was saying, how does having that all in one place, does that make the manager's life, like how do managers react to that when you can see the agency on the roster, so you know in one space who's in the building?
So we work with our agency colleagues in two different ways. So those staff that are really consistent and have become part of our teams, they have got their own login, so they can see. So they don't have a whole profile. We're not holding data about them or any of those sorts of bits, but they can see then what is available and what we still need picking up, if you like. So for those colleagues, managers will give them a call or just drop them a message and say, you know, go in and have a little look and see what's available and what you can do with that. Once they have said what they can do within those, then we can just pull a report and ping that straight to the agencies themselves and say, these are the shifts that we want to book this person for, which has just been absolutely brilliant. And the agencies that we work with really love that too. Then where we are still having to bring new people in, they maybe wouldn't have that set up, but we can still put in onto the rota a different person without necessarily having to create them that account, so they can't see the shifts elsewhere, but we can still see who they are. So this has been an absolute, like, just incredible for me, because I can suddenly see how many different agency colleagues we have across the whole organisation, and it's meant that actually I've really been able to slim down the number of people while not kind of losing any of that effectiveness, because all it's doing is boosting that consistency every time. And I feel like I'm slightly sounding like a broken record, but that's only because it's just so important to people. So where we're working with agency colleagues regularly, even if they're on different sites, it just builds that relationship with us, as well as with the people that they're working alongside. And that just makes everyone's lives so much easier.
Thanks, Becky. There's a load of chat around payroll and paying people correctly. Can you just talk us through how you currently do that and make sure you get that right within your organisation, please?
I think now it's more accurate than it's ever been, because the people that we employ can see exactly what we're going to pay them, because they can see exactly what shifts they've been voted on for, and they can see they've got visibility about whether or not that shift is a contracted shift or overtime shift. So they see that as the month goes through. They also see what's been put down as annual leave. They'll can see for themselves what's been put down as any other type of absence that they might have had. So they already know in advance what's going to go through to payroll. So actually, for us, it's reduced the number of queries and the number of and any confusion that we've had around pay, because that transparency is there.
That's super interesting that you've opened that up with just sort of the transparency. Do you remind me, Becky? Sorry, do you have time and attendance in place?
We don't. No, we don't have time and attendance.
Fantastic. So again, one of the challenges in my where I came from sounds really strange. Back home, my former employer was getting the hours. So again, it's normally the hours that people don't work that are wrong. In my experience, the sickness, the annual leaves, and those things, and that became cured, I guess, when we introduced time and attendance, because it became really simple that if you hadn't clocked in and out of your shift, then you were deemed not to have been there. If the manager didn't know why you weren't there, it would potentially be unpaid, which obviously forces people down the phoning if you're sick and pre-booking your annual leave and having all of that in one place. So I found, and again with staying late, finishing early, it used to be literally tissue. I don't know why, never even paper where I was. It was always like the paper towels that you'd find that I think were everywhere for people drying their hands and cleaning. It was always written on a paper towel. And I'd come in the morning and next to my desk, there'd be, I didn't leave till 8:30. I'm like, cool, who are you? Because it wasn't always apparent to put your names on these pieces of tissue. And that was a way that people didn't get overtime, and it was a frustration. So again, by clocking in and out, that's helped the process. But it's super interesting, Becky, that you're saying actually just the visibility where they know through the month and they can promptly be like, hey, I did this shift and it's not here, or vice versa. You find that it's helping solve those problems.
I think probably previously quite a lot of that goodwill stuff, like, oh, I've come in an hour early to do my training, or because it's helpful for achieving that doctor's appointment or going to see mum, or whatever it might have been, or I've stayed late because somebody got stuck in traffic or their kid needed to go to the doctor and I could do that this time. I think they were the bits that sometimes got missed. So actually this has been really helpful for that, because that message can go straight through to the manager, they can verify it if they need to, and it can go straight on Sona. Member of staff can see it's on there and therefore knows it's going to be in their pay run.
Sorry, Hayley, did you have something to add?
Yeah, just I suppose before we move on to the next question, there was clearly retention recruitment is a massive issue within the social care sector. But if you haven't, guys, there's an article that Skills for Care have released, and they've actually suggested that the workforce has increased only by 0.5%, but that's a positive, right? So we should, I'll pop it in the link actually, it's a really interesting read.
That's great, thanks Hayley. Great stuff. So my next topic to have a little discussion about is about how to align staff skills and expertise with the service user using the roster. So how do we make sure that the right people are being assigned the right shifts? Who would like to kick us off?
I'm going to hand very swiftly over to Becky, but
And to be honest, I don't think it's too dissimilar to some of the things that we've talked about. So, you know, we know the people that we support really well. We're a medium-sized organisation. We support probably about 120 people in supported living, and then we've got another 200 or so in our day opportunities. So we've got a wide skill set within our staff team and a wide set of needs and interests in the people that we support. And that all comes down, I think, to the manager getting to know people really, really well. And those layers in the organisation getting to know people really, really well, and then having that really proactive planning session around their rota. So it is matching to the swimming sessions. It is matching the drivers is one of the most important things, I think, and one of the most difficult things. So being able to manage that skill set to be in the right places at the right time. I think what's lovely about Sona for us, we could only vote 4 weeks in advance before we used this system, and we were doing that on Excel, so it was completely manual. Our manager spent an awful lot of time doing that and then redoing that. If somebody left, it was a nightmare because you couldn't take them off, and if somebody started, it was a nightmare because you couldn't put them on. So then there were kind of handwritten notes on things, whereas now it is completely up to date all of the time. So if somebody wants to go to Legoland with a particular person in 5 weeks' time, we can just put that straight on there. We can ask them, check the member of staff's availability, and it is on there, even if the rest of that week's rota happens not to be for some reason, that can just be put straight in. So I think, yeah, that's how we do it. So it's that kind of communication and making sure people feel really included in it. And that's the bit that really gets that skill matching working.
Becky, just on that point, sorry, just to very briefly interrupt. There is a question in the chat that's going slightly back, but towards when we were talking about the agency use, asking about whether or not your agency staff have access to Sona on their phones. Is that something that they currently have?
So if they have this kind of slimmed down profile that I was talking about, then yes, they can see that on their phones and they can pick shifts up that way. So it depends on our relationship with that agency member of staff as to whether or not they have access, but there are those of them that do.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Becky.
Can I add some colour with that? I tried to explain to Peter, but I think it's just worth carrying. So again, the way Sona specifically handles that is, yes, you absolutely can do as Becky's saying and give people access on their phones. Our tiering system means that they're often the last people that hear about the shifts to fill. So your staff get an opportunity to fill them first before they go to agency. There's also a way where you just have the agency people as placeholders in the system where the comms takes place outside of Sona, but you still add those agency staff when they do book on. So you still have that visibility in the roster. So we talked about earlier, I think that's really important, but you may not want them necessarily accessing shifts to pick up directly on the phone. Sorry, that was just to cover that off. I'd also like to talk about skills mix, if I may.
Yes, let's go back to skills. Rich, go ahead.
I think the other setting where skills mix I think is really important is not necessarily just supported living, although I think that's really important, getting the right people. Again, Becky talked earlier about someone that likes swimming maybe, or someone that can swim is going to be taking people swimming, and those skills to shifts become very, very tangible. And it's something where if someone doesn't have the right skills, they shouldn't be able to work the shift. In, for instance, a care home setting, the skills mix potentially has a different angle where you may need a registered nurse and another person that can dispense medication who may or may not be a registered nurse, and you may need X number of care assistants, some of which need Y qualifications in order to, and then you start to have this matrix of skills that you need in the building at any one time. And I think that can be particularly challenging to say, and often rosters can be over expensive or inefficient because you always have the tools themselves. I always need 2 nurses in it. So well, actually, you might not. If you've got 1 nurse and 1 medication trained care assistant, that's actually cheaper. That's more cost effective, and also arguably you can get more nurses are particularly scarce. Could you have more med trained care assistants? So if you can work out, the first step of scheduling at that point is working out what you actually need and being really honest about what skills mix do you need in the building at any one time, and then trying to fill that, rather than if you start from the wrong place, then the schedule is never going to be that helpful.
So Rich, can I ask a question about the product then?
Yeah.
I was, and look, this is me being relatively new to Sona, but if I was to allocate a care worker or a nurse to a shift or a roster that didn't have the required skills, would Sona prompt you on that or give you visibility? How does it work in the system?
Yeah, so in Sona, it's the same for supported living, which Becky would have. If they can't do that shift, then they wouldn't be able to see it. So if I had a medication shift, for instance, a nurse and a med-trained carer would be able to be assigned to it, would be able to pick it up. But a carer that didn't have that qualification would never see that shift. They wouldn't know it existed. They wouldn't be able to claim it, because Sona's all about prohibiting you getting the wrong skills mix or the wrong people in the wrong place, because that's not okay, right? And that's got various implications. So it's all about, when you set it up, you match the skills of the individuals with the skills of the shift that's required, and that's how you start to match them up.
And for someone looking for a rostering solution but potentially have already got their skills LMS system already in place, how would that work? Is there options to look at integrating the two together, or?
Yeah, so that's an ask that we get a lot, and the answer is yes. We can digest that via an API to have that skills mix. What's really interesting is you start to get into questions which I quite like, and now might not be the forum for it, but it's if I'm a nurse and I'm trained with medication, for instance, and that runs out in 2 weeks' time, and I'm not booked on a course, and Becky's here doing the roster 3 months in advance. Can I book that nurse onto a shift with medication past the 2 weeks when they've expired? Because technically they're not qualified at that. And you start to get, and there's answers to all these questions, but it's really interesting when I get to sit down with providers and take up these questions. They're like, yes, of course we'll integrate. What do you actually want it to do? Oh, that's a great question. And we start to get under the skin about what makes sense, what is a hard no, what might be something where you just want a warning to say, hey, this training's expiring, there's a problem, and all of those sorts of things. So I love the detail, but possibly not want to go too far in now. Sorry, Holly.
No, that's great. Thanks, guys. I'm going to move on to the next kind of topic for us to have a little look at. I would love to know about how you think efficient rostering contributes towards retention of staff. I'm going to go straight to Becky with this one, with any thoughts you have on this.
I think for us, it is all about people being able to plan their lives, and that makes working in health and social care with some of those antisocial shifts that come with it just so much easier for people, because that's what they want to do. And that communication and transparency piece. So being able to see it, they know if changes are made, they're never left in the dark about any of those, they get that notification straight through, and the question will be asked of them if that's okay. That's very much how we work, and building those rotas with our teams. That's the bit that creates reason for people to stay, because we work with them in a way that works for them. So if they've got scouts on a Thursday, because that's really important to their kids, then we'll try our best to rota for that. And generally, if we do that where we can, we get more leeway from people when we can't, and they understand that we try, and we do it whenever possible. I think our retention figures have definitely improved in the last 6 months of this year. We're currently running a staff survey, which I know Rich is really keen to get the answers to, because we've asked some very specific questions about Sona and what impact that's had on people. But in the main, all of the feedback has been really positive, and what people have taken from it is that kind of sense of shared ownership around how it's created, and that sense of I can see what's happening, and that really helps me. Yeah,
that's amazing. I think we touched on it earlier in terms of retention, but for me, it's just all about that visibility. If you've got an easy system to use and your workforce can see what they're doing on a weekly, regular, monthly basis, it makes so much. It makes them so much happier, and it's like any of us. If we didn't know what we were going to do tomorrow, that would drive me bloody crazy. So I'm sure they do enjoy it. There's a really good question that's been posted, actually. I'm going to put it to Rich from Anna-Gail Lehman. How long does it typically take to move from tissue paper to, which made me chuckle, it says Excel rostering to a system like Sona? You're on mute, Rich.
I know. That is a great question. I mean, there's a huge number of variables, right? It depends on the size of the organization and exactly what you're trying to implement. But to actually move over to scheduling on the whole, it doesn't take that long. In fact, I might even defer to Becky. It would probably be more interesting to hear her experience of moving to Sona and how long that implementation and setup took.
So we once we decided that Sona was the one that we want to go with, we spent a bit of time kind of testing the market and done all of those sorts of things. From the point at which we made that decision, we launched a pilot group a couple of weeks later. So 4 of our managers got together on a weekly basis and just tested it. They rolled it out slowly to their teams. So we did that for about 4 weeks, possibly a little bit longer. But the actual shift could have happened overnight, really, if we'd wanted it to. It could have been that quick. We just wanted to make the tweaks and the variations to get it right for us. But once we'd run that pilot group for that 4-week period, that was it. Then the rest of the company, I think the managers were given a couple of weeks to get their rotors on, and that was it. Everyone was on from there. So that 6 weeks for us was a really nice way of doing it, and people felt really included and bought in. But it could definitely have been quicker if we'd have needed it to.
Fantastic. It's worth flagging. Sorry, Hayley. Sort of the size of Becky's organization, and for larger ones, that exact approach is exactly what works. But you would take that as a cluster, for instance, and you may roll out that in sort of those 4 weeks, sort of 2 to 4 weeks to get a cluster of homes out. As Becky said, they could have done it quicker in those sort of timescales. Makes sense. And then you rinse and repeat across the organization, depending on if you're national. Doing it all at once, again, with adequate resource, anything's possible, right? But if you've got somebody spearheading the project, you tend to go cluster by cluster by cluster. So at that point, you're limited by how large you are.
Thanks, Rich. I'm just going to very quickly, we've got loads of questions in the Q&A. So if we don't get to your questions today, we will absolutely reach out and we can have that conversation another time. But the top one on the top of my list right now is from Lee, asking if a support worker would like to pick up a shift, however, they cannot work the full shift, i.e. they need to finish at 6 rather than 8. How does that work with Sona? Rich, this is a question for you.
That is a great question. And this is one of my wishes, sort of roadmap asks that can we completely streamline that process? Yes. At the moment, how does that work? You can pick up the shift and you can message the manager. As soon as you have a shift in a particular organization, you've got direct messaging to the manager. So you can tie it to the shift and be like, hey, I've claimed this, but I need to leave a couple of hours early. Is that all right? And then via time and attendance, it becomes evident that you've left and it knocks it off. That does require a certain amount of knowledge at the moment. I think sort of tacit knowledge that I believe it's going to be okay for me to do that, because obviously once I've picked it up, it takes it away from everyone. The manager can, of course, always cancel it and put that shift back available to everyone. Or the opposite is I can say to the manager, hey, I've seen this shift. I would do it, but I can't. And then pick it up after the conversation, depending on how, as an employee, I guess, how sure you are that it's going to be okay. So we do want to make it so that we can start to automate those workflows. And I can say, I'm going to have it, but only this time. Do I need it? Because usually it's better to have someone for some of the time than no one for any of the time. So I say at the moment, we handle that sort of with communication.
And there's a follow-on question from that as well, Rich, if you don't mind, about how that's then logged. So if a shift needs to change because a support worker is not able to attend, how is it then logged, since it wouldn't be the original shift or a picked up shift necessarily? So how does that look in Sona?
So if I'm understanding, so if a support worker doesn't attend that shift, depending on the notice and depending on the customer, it depends is a really unhelpful answer, but as product, it's one I'm defined to give. If it needs to be marked as absent, that original shift, you can mark that shift as absent, and it will then, the system can then duplicate that shift and say, hey, who did work it then? So you keep the absent shift, so you keep a record of it being absent, and then that duplicated shift, like today, Holly came in to do it, isn't she a hero? And she'd get the shift that appears to be clocked in and out of. If it was moved ahead of time, or even retrospectively for whatever reason, I can always just edit a shift and transfer it, so there'll be no history of it where it was, but it moves over, other than the audit log, of course, where I can see what's happened. So it really depends, Lee. But on the whole, if it's absent, you duplicate that shift to save the manager's time and put the real shift where it needs to be, whilst flagging one as absent. And if it's just actually moved, you can just edit who's assigned to it, and it goes over. And you can do that retrospectively. So a shift may not have been clocked in or out of, and there's no time in attendance because it wasn't worked, and I wasn't there as a manager on the day. The following day, I can still go in and move that shift and say, no, Richard did tell me he was never going to work it, and Holly did it.
Perfect. And sorry, there's lots of questions about specific things in the app here. So are shifts specifically shown on the app and the web browser as originally rostered or picked up for payroll reference? And if so, how does this appear?
Exactly that. So there is an icon on the shift that shows if it had been claimed by the worker as opposed to assigned by the manager, which again, it's super useful for payroll. Some people pay extra for shifts that are picked up in the app. Other people have different approaches. Becky knows all about paying overtime. We've had some interesting discussions about that. But yeah, it's flagged on the roster for the managers to see. It can also affect things like maybe cancellation policies and things. So for instance, if I've picked it up on the app, I might have a grace period whereby actually I could change my mind and cancel it and put it back on the app. Whereas if I've been assigned that shift by a manager, I may get a very different grace period or perhaps no grace period at all. So whether I've picked it up on the app or not is quite important to the system.
Great stuff. I'm just trying to see if there's any more questions on here. Abby's asked a question. Sorry, let me just find one on here. Sorry, can anyone else see a question in the chat that we haven't answered yet? They're all a bit...
There's one for Becky, which makes me happy because it means it's not one for me to ask, which is Becky. Why do you not use time and attendance is the question. Which you have to answer for the record. The answer could just be you don't know or you didn't decide. So
I think we have about 40 different locations. And quite often people's shift will not start at that location, so they might be picking somebody up from work, or they might be picking them up from a friend, or sort of various different things. So it felt like an additional kind of layer of complication at the point of which we were implementing and going from a very papery Excel version to like what felt really high tech. And when we asked our workforce about it, it was a very clear no, that it's not something they wanted to do. So one of the things that was really important for me about implementing Sona was that I had buy-in. I needed people to continue to want this. They told me they wanted an electronic system, and I really wanted to keep that buy-in and that momentum. So when they said no to that, I listened to that.
It's super important that, Becky, that you get engagement and buy-in from the team. There are several benefits to time and attendance, though, and you know we could list them and go from the but from the benefit of, again, back in my experience when we implemented TNA, it was more around the safeguarding, making sure that the staff were safe and not knowing where they were, but knowing that they're safe and they've clocked into Mrs. Jones's house, for instance, or to a supported living area or location. So for me, when I was a manager, that's what I liked about it, being able to see where that person was and how they were getting on with their rota.
That's great. I've got one quick question for Becky, if that's okay. I just wondered if you've got any proof since using Sona that you've had any reduction in agency spend at all, and how you think that's worked for you.
So Sona has had a massive impact on our agency spend. So at the point that we went live in the whole organisation, for the whole organisation, which was around the end of March, we were probably spending 35,000 a week, 40,000 a week roughly on agency usage, which is far bigger than I am comfortable with, and definitely far bigger than my finance director's frown lines can handle. Now, so I pulled the figures just before I had a meeting about this last week just to see, and in the last couple of weeks we're down to £16,000 a week, and that is all to do with how we are offering people. It's also, I don't know about everyone else's agencies, but ours charges different rates for different times. So I can hone down when we use our agency colleagues to make sure that we're using them at the most cost-effective time, and spreading their usage that way. So it had a huge impact from that point of view, and one that I'm absolutely delighted by, but was never my driver, funnily enough, but it's been a really happy byproduct. I
need to hear that again, Becky. You went from what to what?
We went from about 35, 40 grand a week, and we're now down to that sort of 17k a week-ish mark. So it's nearly 20 grand a week at the moment and counting.
Wow,
that's huge.
That's impressive.
Fantastic. I just wanted to answer, it's not so much a question from Peter, but it's a completely valid point. I just want to cover off. It's not quite as exciting as 50% agency reduction, but it's worth covering off the same. Again, Sona as a standalone solution, when we talked about implementation and we talked about timelines, it's really important that Sona is incredibly agnostic with its APIs, and it wants to sit and play nicely with lots of other systems like your learning management providers or your recruitment systems, or some people have alternate HR systems and payroll. And those integrations and the builds, and depending on what's required, can also impact on those timelines. With our open APIs on the whole, we try and do those things quite quickly. But every now and again, there's a legacy provider or something that's a little bit tricky, and that can impact how quickly we roll out. But it all depends. If you want scheduling up and running, that's pretty quick. If you want it embedded as a core part of everything, that can take a little bit longer.
Cool, guys, we've just fit so much into that 35 minutes of chat. Wow, blimmin' heck. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We are going to have Hemel pop on now and do a very quick demo.